All right. Thank you. Very exciting talk so far, and they're very related to what I'm going to talk about. My goal is really to talk about different theories that we heard about and kind of connect them to draw parallels between those theories and these computational methods that people use in machine learning and deep neural network, and just see the ways that we could actually implement those ideas, as I mentioned earlier. And I'll do that through some of our own work, 3 of our own work in the lab. The first one is I put it under the heading of object files. And I think this is the idea that when you attend to an object, the features from those objects could be converging across a hierarchy of feed-forward network, and this could be pre-attentive. And they get gathered into what in cognitive science a lot of people have called object files, and this work is developed mostly by Treisman and Kahneman, if you heard it. In this context, I'll talk about the work that we did, a model that we called OCRA, object-centric recurrent attention, where the model is actually learn to attend to different objects in order to recognize them. The second work is under the heading of top-down reconstruction, and this is a generative process that can target different features of an object, and you heard Patrick talk about this and gave great feedback on that. And also mentioned this work that was led by Seoyoung here on basically creating this top-down reconstruction in order to target different objects. The third work is attention spread that you also heard so far, which is the idea of attention can spread within an object through these lateral connections. And I would say you could call a lot of those lateral connections association fields, and I think that's a term that people are familiar with. In this context, I'll talk about another work that we call affinity spread, and we actually show for the first time we could actually spread attention within an object through purely horizontal connection. You don't really need top-down reconstruction. So this goes slightly against some of the arguments you heard today. So let's just start with the first one. I think what really people in computer science, like machine learning, when they want to have these sorts of object files, they talk about object-centric representation. And these are the representations where you want to group the features of one object into a vector format. And a vector format is really computationally useful. If you have each of your objects in a vector format, you could actually compare them. You could use them for different tasks. You could use them in order to reconstruct the object. How do you get that? Well, if you have multiple objects, you can imagine this hierarchy, as I mentioned, would give you richer and richer features, and then eventually you could have features that belong to different objects being gathered by different object files. We made use of capsule networks from the Hinton group to create these object-centric representations. And the way to think about them is that, well, each category have a slot. So imagine, face cells, place cells, but imagine these are for other categories as well. As I mentioned, we developed this model. The core of the model is basically an autoencoder, as Patrick introduced them, that the goal is to go through an image with attention. So we endowed this model with an attentional selection mechanism that you see in the green. This attention mechanism looks at different parts of the image. It can then encapsulate the features coming from that part of the image into slots, primary slots, and I call them, and output slots, and these are category slots. And it could use that information in order to reconstruct the object or in order to decide where to look next. We trained this model initially to recognize objects in an image, and the goal was to basically, well, what are the two objects, 2 digits that are in the image, and the model learns just through that objective in order to learn, in order to look at one object and then another one. We made sure that the attention mechanism kind of follows the zoom lens theory, where when you get bigger, when you have a bigger attention window, you get a blurry input from the image, but in order to get a more fine-grained details from the image, you have to really have a narrower attention window. And you could see the time changing from the left side to the right side. This model worked very well, and I'm not showing all the details here, I don't have time, but if you look at the paper, we really applied it to overlapping digits, we applied it to other tasks. Another task that we thought would be very nice to apply this model to is a visual reasoning task. The task is really to look at an image and say whether the two objects in it are the same or different from one another. And people have shown that you really need very deep networks in order to do this, because it's not just simple pattern recognition, but rather a comparison between the two patterns. And we thought, well, the way humans would solve this problem is that they would attend to individual objects, kind of abstract the representation in somewhat of a slot, like store them somewhere, and then they compare them to one another. So we applied our model, the same model that I just described, to this task, and we saw that really nice behavior where the model attends to one object, kind of creates an object-centric representation from that, it attends to the next object, and then it can make a decision whether they're the same or different. And we saw that this model really performs on par with really deeper model while being much smaller. So the core of it really is that when the objects are kind of separate from one another and they're not in a complex background, you could really attend to an object by looking at it and then letting your pre-attending feed-forward processing do the job. So that's, I would say, in this regime, in this scenario, such a mechanism would work. So that's the first one, and I think, as I said, that's the conditions that it would work. The second one is the top-down reconstruction, and Patrick already presented this, so I don't have to go through this. This is the work led by Young, where the idea was that, well, sure, we could also think about how reconstruction can be used in order to target the features. So in this case, you have a bird, and as you can see here on the right, we're also showing kind of that the features of the bird are gathered in some sort of, object file way. We could discuss whether that's, literally true in the brain, or that is some abstract level you get the features of the bird kind of associated with one another. But you could use that object reconstruction in order to really target the features of the bird, and you could use that reconstruction to bring it back and modulate activity somewhere like V1, where the activity is fine enough, like high resolution enough where that reconstruction could be applied. This reconstruction does not have to be very accurate, right? You really need a silhouette of the object. So some people say, oh, reconstruction is, takes a lot of energy, or it's very computationally expensive. It doesn't have to be that accurate, so in order to be useful. So as I said, using this reconstruction, in this case applied to a MNIST digit encoder, you could imagine that through a reconstructive process, you could actually attend to the object. You could also use that reconstruction-based signal to modulate the routing between different capsules and stuff like that. Again, don't have time to go through this, but check out the paper. When we applied this, as I said, to different distorted MNIST images, we saw that the model outperforms the CNN model. Also, when we applied it to ImageNet corruption, we saw that the model becomes much more robust when you have this top-down reconstruction targeting the right features. Like it's forming a hypothesis. Okay, this is what I think is in the image. Let me target the right part of it until I become sure about it. So there is this recurrent process going on there. The model steps correlate well with human RT when they do the same recognition task. The type of errors that the model makes correlate better with the models that humans make, so it's more realistic in terms of error consistency. So what if we're applying this to two objects? Well, what you could see is that the model now can generate this sort of sequential masks or sequential object reconstructions in order to attend to individual objects, recognize them, and then attend to the second object and then recognize that too. And we're showing that that's possible with this approach, right? These sorts of overlapping digits or overlapping images are kind of one of the litmus tests of people thinking about object-based attention, and I think this approach can really get you that. All right, if you're more interested in learning about the top-down approach in order to predict attention, Seoyoung is giving a poster, but also there's a talk tomorrow morning that is using diffusion models in order to generate targets in the periphery in order to be able to attend to it. It's really interesting, both of them. That's the second one. So the third one, Paolo showed this picture where attention is spreading from the dark circle into the object. Now, when you have simple displays like this where you have a line, you can imagine attention can spread through association fields. And association fields are really mediated by these long-range horizontal connections. That in this case, you can imagine the association field is based on collinearity, based on the fact that these lines are kind of following along a path. You could have V1 type of features help you spread attention. Well, but what if in this case? What if you have a zebra and then you're starting from that center point? How would attention spread here? You cannot really spread it in V1 because, well, V1 is rather, as I said, if you're just following association field based on collinearity and orientation, you're just going to go along a stripe. You're not really going to spread within the object. We think we could model the sort of high-level contextual connections or high-level association fields with something called affinity, which is based on the feature similarity between patches of the image. But in order to do that, I'm going to have to do a little bit about transformers. Transformers, like vision transformers, when they're applied on images, they divide the image into patches, right? That's because you need tokens. And these tokens get encoded, the representations get encoded, and then you look at the similarity of the feature representations of different tokens, and then you see how similar they are to each other, and then they could become more similar. It's what they call self-attention. And you could do that across multiple levels. What you get at the end, you get a vector representation for each patch. Now, earlier I was talking about vector representation for the whole object. Now I'm talking about having vector representation for each patch of the image. Well, what could that give you? Well, you could look at an individual patch and see what is the cosine similarity of that vector representation to all the other vector representations in the image. And then you get a map like this. This is what I'm calling affinity map. It shows how similar the representation of this part of the object is to all the other parts of the image. You could look at another affinity map for a different patch. These affinity maps, what we want from them in higher area is that they would be object-centric, that they're not just following low-level features at this point. They are more similar, something like firing together, wiring together, right? So I'm saying because the representation of that patch is similar to another patch, then they're both activated, and they're both kind of dynamically connected to one another. But it's not always object-centric. You could have the affinity map of the ear, for example, be similar to the feature of the other zebra's ears rather than the body of the zebra. So it's not completely object-centric. And another one. So we collected some behavioral data before I show you the modeling work, where we have the paradigm is similar to the ones that you saw so far. There are two dots, and people have to decide whether they're on the same object or not. So in this case, the center dot appears. It's on the same object, kind of close, same object far, different object close, different object far. So we have these four conditions. We have 255 images that appear in these four conditions. And when we look at the reaction time, this is what someone called same object advantage. You see the same object advantage. When the second dot is in the same object, people are faster. But also we see the same object advantage for the dots that are closer. So not only you're faster when the dot is in the same object, when it's closer to the center dot, people are faster. So how do you interpret this? Well, you interpret it as the fact that when the attention is spreading, it reaches the closer dot faster than the farther dot. And then when it spreads within the object, then you say, okay, it's on a different object. So that's how you get this behavioral pattern. And we were able to replicate that in this natural scene condition. Okay, I don't have time to go through this, but note that there are individual differences within each condition. That when you have, for example, dots appearing on a narrower part of the object, you're a little slower. When it appears on different parts of the object, that the texture are different, you're slower. So there are variability within each condition. Okay, how does this method work? Well, now we have the affinity maps. We have these object-centric association fields, and I think that would be cool if some neurophysiologists would look for these in the brain. if you could say, okay, how similar is this patch to the patches around it? So let's spread to the patches that are really similar. Then you have a segment, and you say, okay, let me look at all the patches that are similar to this segment. As the segment grows, every patch in the segment now votes where to spread. And if you do that, you could just spread a little bit more, and then through that process, you could spread within the zebra. And I could show that in a more dynamic way, where the attention can, through these association, fully spread. The important takeaway here is that what was really surprising to me, at least, was that objectness could be embedded in lateral connectivity. It does not have to come from a top-down place, right? In lateral connectivity, you could have objectness embedded in a way that you could spread attention within a complex object like a zebra without relying on top-down connection, just because the system has really rich representations. All right, we could look at the number of steps that the model took in order to reach the second dot for different conditions, and look at the histogram of that. And then the bars you see on the right are cases where the attention never reached the second dot, which is, you could imagine, is much more common in the different condition than the same condition. Then we could look at the number of steps and average them for condition. What we see is that we could replicate the pattern that we saw earlier in human behavior through this method. I'm giving a longer talk on this, the last section, on Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. in this room, so if you want to know more about it. So to summarize, initially I started calling these theories of attention, object-based attention, but I think a more appropriate term is to call them computational components, right? I think in different conditions, you could use different mechanisms. You do not have to, like for example, in the first condition, we used reconstruction too in order to do that task. In the last, in the attention spread, we had a spread, but we also were relying on object-centric representation. So I think depending on experimental conditions, subjects and models, mirroring subjects, can use different types of mechanisms in order to basically segment an object or attend to an object or target an object. With that, I thank you and my collaborators.
We're a little over time, so I will take just one question.
Thank you, very interesting. I was wondering still about that spread of attention, and I don't understand what you're saying when you say that you don't need feedback in order for the spread to happen. It can happen with only lateral connection. I don't understand. How does that stop at the boundary if it is only a lateral connection system?
Great question. So stopping at the boundary in this case was my choice at 15 steps. So you're absolutely right. How do you know when to stop? In this case, because we're going to the second dot and we know the dots are in the object, it's not a problem. But I think if we tune the spread in order to understand, okay, I'm at the boundaries of the object, it could stop. But in this case, we're not doing that. But that's something we could do.
So that, the only solution that I can see is that embedded within the lateral connection, you have some decay parameter that would know for some reason that after a while you have to, which already means that you know the size of the object, which already means that you have some feedback somehow, right?
Not necessarily, right? You could at each step of the process, you could imagine, okay, is this a full zebra? Is this a full zebra? You could have the mechanisms in order to know when to stop, not necessarily. I know we all want to reach for top-down and divine intervention, but I think you could do a lot of things locally.
Thank you.